Right, let's go ahead and get started. Today we are going to talk about tips and tricks for oral history interviewing. I'm Lisa Vallen. I'm the Southern Labor Archivist at Georgia State University, and I'm here with.
I'm Morna Gerrard. I'm the archivist for women's and gender and sexuality collections at Georgia State.
Okay. So to start off with, let's talk about what makes a good oral history. And so we want to interview someone who's knowledgeable about the topic. We want a well-prepared interviewer. We want to have done our research, have our list of questions, have a good space that's set up. We want a well-prepared narrator. So we want to make sure that we've gone over what this project's going to be like, how the interview is going to be shared, have them really understand what's going to happen, and that they can have informed consent. We want clear audio, so we don't want anything muffled. It's sometimes best to do it when you are not wearing masks, if that can be done safely. And then we want a non-distracting background. We don't want a ton of things happening in the background. It distracts people. We really want the focus to be on our narrator. So some things to consider. First is scheduling. So what is an appropriate day of the week, time of day for the narrator? Do they work? Are they a morning person or are they more of a night person? If they're a night person, you probably don't want to schedule it at 8 o'clock in the morning. How much time are you going to need? Are they a talker? That's going to mean it's going to be a much longer interview. It might take multiple days. How much time does your narrator have? You know, we work. And so being respectful of their schedule and how much time they can devote to that. So that might mean you have to do several shorter sessions, which comes into my next point of, are you going to need multiple days? That again really depends on the person and the type of interview that you're doing. So you want to allow for time to do your setup and for your takedown. And also allow for times for breaks. You don't really want to go for longer than 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours without taking a break. It gives both of you time to, get up, stretch your legs, use the restroom, have a quick snack to keep the energy going. Okay. Yes, you want to allow for time to set up and take down. And yeah, all right. Also things to consider, we want to make sure our narrator, the person that we're interviewing, is prepared. So when you first talk with them, share your big picture information about the project, talk about how it's going to be used and shared. It's great if you have examples of a finished product from your project or a similar project so that they can kind of wrap their head around what this is going to be like and how it's going to be used and shared. Feel free to use our oral history collections as an example. We have some really great collections available in our digital projects. And so this is really just helping our narrator be fully aware of what's going to happen. We provide an interviewee packet that has more detailed information. It has a list of potential questions we might ask, and that's something you can go over with them. Are there any topics they're uncomfortable or not wanting to talk about? That's good to do in your initial discussion so you know what topics to avoid. And we also want to make sure we provide the packet to them a couple of weeks before the interview, so that they again have time to look it over and be fully informed. Offer to meet with them before the interview happens so that they can put a face to a name, helps them be at ease. And encourage questions. You again want them to be fully informed. So whatever questions they have, no matter how silly they think they are, encourage them to ask it.
Okay. So let's talk about location. When you're planning an interview, you need to be able to find a spot that is quiet. It's the most important thing. This means that if you're hosting the interview in person, you personally will scout out a place that is free of noise and interruptions. This is the room that we do most of our interviews in. If we're doing them here in our department, this is a colloquium room. We can kind of control the noise that goes on around it. But if you're going to be doing an interview off-site, at home or an office of the interviewee, I would check in with them ahead of time and let them know that you need to have a quiet space to set up. And that usually means not the kitchen and not where dogs are located. We'll talk a little bit about more about that kind of thing just in a little while. You need to make sure that the setup that you have is actually comfortable. So check in to see that the seating you're using, that something as simple as that, is that comfortable? You're going to be sitting for up to at least 2 hours, potentially, sometimes longer. Also, you want to make sure that the chairs that you're sitting in are not too far apart, because you don't want to feel like you have to shout to one another when you're actually doing the interview. If possible, try to avoid environmental distractions. And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But this means trying to arrange the interview on days where maybe the yard guys aren't running their equipment outside, or if you're in somebody's office, try and stay away from phone banks or elevators or restrooms. I will tell you, there was one location that we used to have on campus here in another building that it was set up as an interviewing kind of booth, like a little room in another building. Unfortunately, it was right beside the women's restrooms in that building. And it was the noisiest bathrooms I've ever heard in my entire life. And, throughout the interview, you could actually hear people coming, going in the bathrooms, and this noise when the toilets would flush. That's not what you want to happen. We no longer use that room specifically for that reason. If they have children, make sure that the kids are with a sitter. Maybe the dogs are in another room, at least another room, maybe with a sitter as well. Check the weather before you do your interview. If there's going to be a tornado warning, or if there's going to be a very severe thunderstorm, you're going to want to make sure that that's not going to be happening at the time of your interview. And if it is, consider changing the time of the interview. I actually had to do that last Friday afternoon because we had threats of tornadoes, massive thunderstorm, and 70-mile-an-hour winds. And so we just agreed to change the time of the interview. If you're conducting an interview in someone's home or office, be prepared to move some furniture. I do this all the time. Of course, you have to ask first. You don't just walk into somebody's office and take over and say, I'm going to change all of this. Again, you want to be facing one another with the equipment close enough so that you can hear the sound of both voices. And not every office is set up that way. So you may want to sort of be creative in the way that you think about the space. Places that you might want to consider doing interviews include your homes. But if it's in homes, think about children, dogs, no kitchens. Is a room carpeted? Because it might be echoey if it's not carpeted, things like that. Offices can be used as well. However, think about phones, because in offices, there's phones going off all the time. Other employees having conversations or just going about their business. Can you set up a situation where that's not actually going to happen? Libraries often have rooms that you can either rent or use for free. But a library is a functioning building, so there's things going on around you as well. There might be another event somewhere. There might just be people talking. You need to check in ahead of time, like go scope the space out before the interview takes place to make sure that you know what kind of sounds you might be dealing with. Historical societies can often be very helpful for setting up locations for you. I actually use the Historical Society in Savannah a couple of different times, 2 or 3 times actually, to do interviews for the Women's March project that I have. And the staff were really super helpful in helping me set that up. But again, we did these on a day where the Historical Society was open, And so we did have to be aware that there's going to be stuff going on around us. Nursing homes also may be places where you can do interviews. And I think, Lisa, you may have already done one in a nursing home. I certainly have. And, you know, they're often very, very helpful about finding you a location that you can set up. Again, it's a space where there's a functioning space. So the things that I heard during the interview that I did in a nursing home, elevators, we were relatively close to an elevator bank. So you heard the pinging of the elevators, and the afternoon tea people, they were coming around with the, you know, cups of tea or coffee, and you could hear the clanging of the glasses and cups and things like that outside of the room. So, you know, these are things that you might want to think about. Another place I actually once had to set up, and this was not something I wanted to do, but the person being interviewed was determined to do it. We actually set up in the old Caris bookstore that was in Little Five Points, just because that place had such meaning to the person being interviewed. However, it was open to the public, and so people are coming in and out buying books, and they had one of the squeakiest floors of squeaky floors, and so you could hear me the whole time that we were doing the interview. So these, you know, it's hard to find the perfect spot, but you know, if you give yourself some time to plan it, it shouldn't be too bad. Do you want to forward this slide, Lisa? Cool. So let's look more closely at environmental issues. Air conditioners and fans, they are things that you don't really pay much attention to in your own house. But when you suddenly start interviewing somebody in their own house, and out of nowhere, this old air conditioner kicks in that's maybe just right beside where you're doing the interview, it's very, very loud, and it can be very intrusive. And this actually happened. If you want to play the video, Elaine's video.
Since we're doing this, I want to give you a quick tour, just so you understand that I have not been exaggerating one bit. Come on. All right. Come on. Come on. Release. Please release me. Let me go.
So what you have here with this video is a couple of different things. First off, you probably didn't hear it too much, which is great. I'm very happy about that. But there were two different fans going on either side of Elaine. And she could not turn them off because she has a health issue that requires that she stay cool. So that was not something, you know, originally I was like, can we maybe not do this? And we just couldn't. So we had to sort of like to deal with the fans. And we will talk a little bit more in a moment about the challenges with Zoom. But I will just say this because this is something that came up here. You can't control what somebody's going to do with their own laptop or computer. So there was a lot of like moving around because she was excited to show me her space. So there was a lot of distraction going on in that particular environment. Other distractions I have experienced, and I'm sure Lisa you have too. Landscapers are among the noisiest, and I touched on this a little bit before. I never, ever arrange to do an oral history at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning from my house, because that's the time that 3 different neighbors have their landscaper come and do all of their work. So it's very, very noisy outside of my house at that time of day. And you can't tell them to stop doing their work. That's not feasible. Animals can also be an issue. I have had dogs barking, I've had parrots squawking, I've had cats meowing. There was one interview where actually a dog tried to eat the microphone. That's not ideal. You could actually hear it going while it chewed on it. So if you can have animals out of the way, that would be wonderful. As I said before, weather can be very challenging. Loud thunderstorms are invasive, and I think I've done a couple of interviews where there have been loud thunderstorms. Not only is the sound invasive, if you're doing them virtually, they might actually affect your equipment, because, you know, if there's static or you get hit close to your house, anything like that, you might end up, you know, losing your power. Another issue, and we're going to show you this in just a second, are household noises. Things like try and maybe stay away from the kitchen, because that's where you have your fridge and your freezer, and you have an ice maker potentially in your fridge or freezer, and that makes a lot of noise. Clocks, big, you know, if you've got chiming clocks, maybe put them on pause for a minute. You know, try and keep people out of the space. And what we're going to show you is this awesome video of Mr. Charlie Brown, who's one of Atlanta's most beloved drag queens. And you know, before the interview, I had talked to Charlie about, let's not do it in the kitchen. Nobody should, you know, be in the room with us. No dogs, no husbands. You know, try and find a quiet spot. So we arrived, and it ended up being in the kitchen with a dog, and with all of the chiming clocks in the world that ever existed. They're all in, I think they're all in Charlie's house. There was his husband decided to put on a coffee maker just as we were doing the interview. So you're going to hear a bunch of different things when we play this video.
Drag then was the best you could do in makeup. You found friends that would help you with your wigs, and some drag queens. Well, luckily the club I work at, these queens were from Chicago and Indianapolis. They moved to Nashville to do the show, and they could get my wigs and everything for me. But just who could sew for you, and you, if you could find something with a secret on, you grabbed it at Goodwill, you know. But you worked your way into it.
Yeah, you can't hear too bad. His coffee machine is probably the loudest in the history of coffee machines. And every 15 minutes, every cuckoo clock and chiming clock in the entire house rang for the time. So it was actually a wonderful, wonderful interview. And Charlie Brown put his makeup on while he was being interviewed, and it was awesome. But there were real challenges. Once we had started the interview and we realized this was going to happen, you just have to go with it. You just make the best of it. You smile, you carry on. If something is like really, really invasive and you know, completely, you know, untenable, then you can stop the interview and say, let's find another spot to do this. But we made that one work, and it's probably our most viewed video. So people love it in spite of all of that stuff that happened. So let's move forward. You need to look at supplies. You can't just turn up to an interview and not have stuff with you. So what do you take with you? Make sure that you have recording devices. Ensure that they're charged. You don't want anything to be losing its charge mid-interview. In case that does happen, take a charger with you. I always take at least 2 different audio recorders plus a video recorder, because you never know what's going to work, what's not going to work. Take a tripod. If you're going to be doing a video interview, take a tripod with you. You do not want to be holding a video camera. It's going to get shaky. A tripod will keep it nice and steady. You also maybe want to take with you an extension cord. You can't guarantee that wherever you're going to be doing the interview, there's going to be a plug nearby or an outlet nearby. So you need to have a long enough extension cord that you could pretty much plug in anywhere within a reasonable distance of the actual interview. Have all of your background information with you. I think Lisa mentioned this earlier. It's like you're going to have done a bunch of research before you interview this person. Well, you should have, you know, hopefully you have time to do all of that. Take all your notes about this person with you in case you need to refer to them. Also take your list of questions. I always have a paper list of questions. I have it on my computer, but I also bring a paper one just in case I need the paper one. And also, if I have a paper list of questions and I have a writing implement, I can be making notes as I'm going along. If the interviewee brings up something that I know I want to come back and revisit, I'll make a note, and that will sort of prompt me to come back and do that as we move forward. I always print my questions at 14 point because I want them big enough that I don't have to be squinting to have a look at them. and I want to be able to just glance down rather than like really look hard at what I'm looking at. Also, you need to bring your paperwork, and by paperwork I mean your release form, a deed of gift, whatever form you're using that will transfer ownership of the interview to you. You need to make sure that you have a copy of that with you. Also bring water. And I will say, just as a reminder, the paperwork, and we've said this before, and I will say it again, do not complete the paperwork until immediately after the interview. You want the interviewee to be aware of what they've already spoken about and be then comfortable with signing off on their interview. Some interviewees will come prepared. You know, we send them a copy of the release form ahead of time, and they'll come prepared with it already filled out. And I actually want them to do this afterwards. I don't want them to do this ahead of time. Bring water. Even if I'm going to somebody's house, I generally bring a bottle of water for them. It's just good manners. It means that you're thinking about them. You care about the fact that they're going to be talking a lot and that they're going to potentially get dry. If they want to provide their own water in a glass, encourage them not to use ice, because when they pick up a glass of water with ice in it, it will rattle. And you've got to think about all these like really practical little things that will cause you to have interruptions or, you know, stuff getting in the way. I always bring tissues as well when I'm interviewing someone. There are a couple of reasons for this. A lot of the interviews that we do, at some point throughout the interview, the person will be a little bit tearful. And we don't try and make people tearful, but sometimes topics come up where, you know, people contemplate things in the past and it makes them a little teary. Having tissues available is really super helpful for that. We also live in the South. We live in Georgia and Atlanta, like most of us here, and allergies are horrible in the South. Most people have a runny nose at some point. I would recommend having tissues so that you don't end up having somebody sniff all the way through an interview. I personally would be mortified if I was considered a sniffer, you know, in my own oral history. Somebody was watching it or listening to it later and all they could hear was me sniffing. I would be horrified. So, you know, have tissues available for folks if they need them. And then finally, and we've touched on this in previous, excuse me, I'm going to actually blow my nose right now. We've touched on this in previous workshops. You might want to take a gift with you. Depending on the situation, it may or may not be appropriate to take a gift. And I showed you before, this is what we have. It's a mug that says Special Collections and Archives, Georgia State University. It's an awesome mug. Any kind of swag that we have available, buttons, bookmarks, you know, leaflets, things like that, we'll take that with us as well. But it's nice to have a gift, and it does not need to be expensive. It really is the thought that counts. People just, you know, they're giving you their time, they're giving you their energy. It's nice to respond to that with something nice. We can move forward. In terms of physical comfort, as I said earlier, it's important for you to ensure both you and your interviewee are sitting comfortably, as you will be sitting for quite a while. If you're in control of the environment, be sure to select a supportive chair. You might also want to have cushions available. Certainly I interview older people and a lot of them have bad backs. So you might want to say, you know, do you need a cushion for your chair? All of that kind of stuff. If you're conducting the interview in your narrators.
I think we have a couple of slides before we get to this part.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely correct. You go.
Sorry. No worries. So some things to consider in an interview are emotions, omissions, and tangents. And so we need to be mindful of our interviewees' layered identities, particularly their gender, age, and other dynamics that might affect your relationship with the narrator and the project overall. Great things can come out of silences. Give them space to think and add on to what they say. So really lean into it. Let it get long and awkward. Just lean into it. I know in the beginning it's going to be very uncomfortable for you, but you want to make sure you give them the opportunity to finish. And a lot of really insightful things can come out of those silences. And especially in the beginning of your interview, especially if you don't know the narrator well, you don't quite know the cadence of their speech yet. And so if you jump in too early, you're going to have cut them off before they're finished. So be ready for difficult or traumatic topics. Like Morna mentioned earlier, oral history is emotional work. And it's our role as the interviewer to acknowledge that without intervening in the story or pulling the focus away from the interviewee. You know, you might cry as well, and that's okay. But being aware that there is going to be emotions here, and you need to produce a safe environment for those emotions to happen. And so you're going to need to allow room for tangents. That's generally how people talk. They go off on tangents. So don't interrupt and direct them back to the topic. Let them finish the topic, the tangent. Write yourself a note that you need to circle back to whatever you were talking about. And also the tangent might produce more questions you want to ask. It's okay if the oral history does not happen in a linear fashion. That's where indexing or transcriptions come in handy in the end product. And so your success and quality is going to vary. You can't control every aspect of the setting, the environment, or the conversation. You are not really that much in control. And if you try and cling on to control too hard, you're really going to stifle the interview. So we're going to dig into some of these topics now. So let's talk about strong emotions. So you're going to encounter a lot of different emotions during the interview, and all of them are valid. So anger, if it gets too intense, you can offer a break. You can always frame it around a bathroom break so they don't feel offended. It's like, hey, I think like we've reached a good point for a bathroom break. Let's circle back to this once we've taken a break. And it gives them time to compose themselves and kind of get back into the groove of things. It's okay to laugh with them. It's really weird if you don't, and it makes them really awkward, and you've now broken the trust that you have built. You know, when you're doing this interview, you're working on building this rapport between you and your narrator. And by not laughing with them, you have broken it. And it, like I said, long silences, let them linger in it. Just kind of like you do at your therapist. You know, let it sit until you're sure they're done answering. And tears. People are going to cry, and it's okay. If they are sobbing, suggest a break so they have some time to gather themselves again and, you know, blow their nose and wipe their eyes and all of that. But having Kleenex on hand is great. And be compassionate, but don't interject. Don't make yourself part of the story. That's part of being a human, is to comfort, is to emphasize with them. And we try not to insert ourselves in the story, but it is okay if you cry too. And that sometimes happens. And so here we have an example.
I lost it. And I remember, like, when I saw this 85-year-old woman who had her walker and had a sign that was pinned to her chest on one of the side streets. I lost it. Because I felt like you've done this already. You've done this already probably billions of times for us. And you're out here again. And that's badass. That's super badass. Because her walker had a seat, and I know that she was tired. Had her walker resting on it, which is amazing sign. So I took a picture with her. Because that's how I felt. I felt that lineage. I felt connected to the women. 30, 20, 40, 50, 60. All the way now, we're still doing things wow. We're still having to justify our existence and not apologize for it and say,
And so you can see she's teary, you know, she's blowing her nose, wiping her eyes, but she can keep going. And that's just one of the examples that we see of tears and emotion in interviews. So for tangents, we want to be patient. We don't want to interrupt it. It can lead to really great things and topics you weren't even aware you should explore. And like I mentioned, you know, just take notes on what you want to circle back on to get yourself back on track once the tangent is done. And sometimes like you follow up on the tangent before you come back to what you're originally talking about. And I have a really great example here with Clarence Williams as part of our Voices of Labor collection.
What we call the plant road, the road that runs by the edge of the sports plant there at that time. And he's handing out stuff. So I said, what's that? And he had on the sheet and the peak hood. And I said, Miller, look. And there was one here and another one up front. And I said, pull up next to him. And he pulled up next to him and we all jumped out and said, give me one of those. And he started to run. And the guy that was up the street behind him saw, and he started to run. They ran like fire across the railroad track. But we didn't know, didn't care. But it was a flyer that said something about a rally. They threw down the flyers and took off. And later, a number of years later, there was a Klan rally.
And so he's talking about in his workplace discrimination that he's seen and the activities of the KKK. And not even a minute later, we're still going.
We knew on the streetcar, you get on with it. We knew that if you had a transfer when you got off the streetcar, first off, always get a transfer. When you get off, hand it to the person standing there. It didn't matter whether they were white, black, blue, or green. And the whites would do the same thing. And so we always knew to do that. And so Atlanta actually grew up, in my opinion, as a kind of cohesive city. It used to be, it's getting more polarized now, I think, than it's ever been. But when I was a kid, heck, it was just, we all around town, we all struggling to try to make ends meet. And so that's how we would help each other. You know, I remember as a kid shopping for one.
And so this is all from the same question about discrimination in his workplace. And so we get an answer about the Klan distributing flyers at his workplace, and then him talking about public transit in Atlanta and the interaction between races. And it's a great interview. It's a great tangent that has a really lot of valuable information in it. And so you let it go and see where it takes you. And so sometimes you are not going to get an answer. And you might not get an answer for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're distracted by something that's going on in the room. Maybe there was a noise. And so you can always ask the question again. Maybe they don't want to answer, and that's okay. You can ask if they're uncomfortable answering, and if they say yes, you move on. You do not try and circle back and get an answer again. Because again, this is about building trust. And if they don't want to answer it, they don't have to. And so sometimes they can't remember. And again, that's okay. You can't force someone to remember something. And so we have an example here of an interview with Frank Gerrard.
How old were you when you moved from the north side further into Chicago to that Croatian community?
I forgot the actual age. And I don't. There again, I'm one of the few that forget everything. I don't.
It surprises me. I couldn't come up with a good answer.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
That shows you gotta wake up, Frank, and remember things more and more and more, and boy, oh boy, it's hard for me to remember everything.
What was that move like? Did you enjoy it? Were you upset that you were moving?
No, I enjoy the life that I had, and we can't argue. Kids grew up together, and they learned. They selected their employees what they like to do.
And so I first asked him about a specific date on when they moved. And people have a hard time remembering dates. So then I tried asking the question in a different way, talking about emotion, because people generally remember the emotions they felt around an event more so than maybe the specific details. So that's another way that you can try and reframe a question to get an answer. But if they're still having trouble answering that question, then it might be time to just move on to a different topic.
Now I'm going to talk about the chairs. So, as I said earlier, physical comfort is important. Make sure that, you know, if you're providing the chairs, that they're comfortable. You may have cushions available. If you're going to somebody else's, you know, home or office, check in with them ahead of time and just say, look, this is going to be a long interview, potentially. Please make sure that you have a chair for yourself that you're comfortable in. In terms of emotional comfort, because that's something you really have to consider as well. Before the interview begins, make sure that the interviewee knows that they don't have to talk about anything that makes them uncomfortable. You've heard us talk about this again and again and again throughout all of these workshops, and we can't emphasize this enough. This is not an experience that anyone should feel picked upon, or when we're not trying to do gotcha interviews. This should be an enjoyable, uplifting experience for people. And so, you know, we want to make sure that they don't feel like we're, you know, trying to make them feel anything other than that. I always let the narrator know that I might be looking down at my notes as well, because I don't want them to think that I'm not paying attention to them. Active listening in an interview is incredibly important, and it's very important that the person you're interviewing knows that you are actively listening to them. Generally, when people have a conversation, we don't fully actively listen. We kind of pay attention so that we can then add the next part of our conversation. And oral histories don't work that way. You're meant to be guiding the interview. You're not meant to be all in, like talking the whole time. So, you know, pay attention to where it's going. Let the interviewee know that you're paying attention to where it's going, that you're trying to keep it on track. And in order to do that, you may have to look down sometimes. You may have to take notes, just as Lisa said, if you're having to circle back to come back to something. And actually reinforce all of that by saying, look, I'm going to keep my talking to a minimum. I want this to be about you. I don't want this to be about me. So you'll normally in a conversation, we'll go, you know, we'll give little sort of additional, you know, prompts that let people know that we're listening. We don't want to do that in an oral history, and it feels weird not doing it. And so by letting the interviewee know that this is something you're working on, to be sure that you don't do it, because it's better for the interview generally and better for transcription and, you know, all sorts. That will let them know that this is, you know, something you're taking seriously, and there's a good reason for it. And further, you know, you can use just because you're not talking doesn't mean you can't use your facial expressions and body expressions to let them know that you're paying attention. My eyebrows go up and down all the time when I'm doing an oral history, because I'm like, oh, you know, I'm like, without me saying, oh, my face is saying it, and I, you know, I might lean forward a little bit when they're telling me something that's like really juicy or really interesting, that, just let them know by your physicality that you're actually paying attention, because there's nothing worse than talking to thin air and nobody's actually sort of paying attention to you. Yeah, good. So Zoom we're working with Zoom right now. It's an awesome tool. We did a great many interviews using Zoom during the COVID pandemic. I don't think if we hadn't had that pandemic, I don't know that oral historians would have taken Zoom as seriously as they did, because it's not perfect. I'm going to say that right up front. But it's all that we had for a while. And actually, there were some really good things about it. I think one of the most important, awesome things was that distance was no longer a barrier. I don't have a lot of money to go to other cities or to other countries to interview anybody. So I tend to focus on people who are local. However, during the COVID pandemic, I interviewed somebody in the mountains up in New York State. I interviewed a couple of folks in Florida and Fort Lauderdale. I even interviewed somebody in Abu Dhabi. I had to get up very, very early in the morning to do it, but it's like distance is no object. The world has become a much smaller place because we have the ability to do virtual interviews. And it's also great if there's a pandemic, if everybody's potentially can get sick, you don't have to be in the same room as them. So that's also a nice thing to think about. One of the nice things about Zoom is that it does have, I think every iteration of Zoom has a built-in recording option. I would recommend that if you are using Zoom, use at least probably the sort of the pay version that's like the lowest pay version, which is like, I think I maybe spend like $15 a month on that, because that allows you to interview people for longer than 40 minutes. You can go, I think, as long as 24 hours with that version. The business version also has a built-in transcription option. However, the business option is $2,000 or thereabouts per year. Our library will not pay for that. So our endowments pay for our business version of Zoom. And, yes, there is a transcription option. It's not fabulous. It's basic. It's a little like if you use Otter or some of the other, online transcription tools. It doesn't always understand Southern accents. It's really quite rough. And I would never recommend that you immediately make that iteration of a transcript available to anybody. I would go back behind and clean it up, because there's going to be quite extensive cleanup. But at least it's a start to get something moving forward. One of the other nice things is, and I have definitely found this, if people are being interviewed in the comfort of their own homes or their own offices, they tend to be a lot more relaxed. They might be more open to whatever questions you're asking, and they might they're more willing to stay longer. If they're not trying to think about how on earth am I getting home in this Atlanta traffic at whatever time of day they're trying to get out of here, but I'm already in my own home. I don't have to get home. My restroom is close by. I feel safe. I feel comfortable. Then you're much more likely to get like longer, more detailed interviews. I think my longest one was the person I interviewed in Fort Lauderdale. I did 2 interviews. The first one was 5.5 hours and the second one was 3.5 hours. And the only reason we stopped the 5.5 hour one was because the narrator was like, I'm going out for dinner tonight. I need to go get ready. He was incredibly comfortable, just hanging out in his house. And it was really quite wonderful. On the flip side of that, there can be some challenges with using Zoom or any virtual platform. All of the environmental issues we talked about before are kind of heightened somewhat, because you're not in the same room with that person. You cannot control their environment. You can control your own environment, but you cannot control their environment. You can't, make sure that they're sitting still or anything like that. As you saw before with my beautiful, wonderful Elaine, you know, she was moving her laptop all over the place. And like, I couldn't stop her doing that. That was, you know, just something I had to kind of go with. So, you know, you just kind of have to be flexible. You want to set up, you know, you have conversations before you do the interviews, just saying, this is how I want it to go, if possible. And then you kind of just have to let it play out as far as possible, you know, once you started. Further, we cannot control the internet. I actually never do interviews from this location here because, believe it or not, this physical space I'm sitting in right now, I get dropped from meetings constantly. The internet in this room is not great. So I do all of my interviews at home. I have a booster, an internet booster in my home office so that I know that I have a strong signal. So, you know, that's just something I've learned from some hard lessons, that's something that you have to do. If I am going to interview someone via Zoom, but a few days before that interview, I arranged for a what I call a tech check, and that allows us to check that our internets will work together. Also, I can check to see if their lighting is decent and if their background is okay. So it just allows us to look at the environment. I will say there are two folks that we've done that with, where one of them had to go to a completely different house because we realized that the internet at his house was just so terrible that we could not conduct the interview at all if it was there. And the other person had to find another room in their home because the internet in a particular room wasn't strong. They also had to tell their partner that they couldn't use the internet while we were doing our interview because that was going to drain it too much. And even then, with that person, we actually had to go over to audio only because the video option was going to use up too much bandwidth to make the interview function properly. So you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to sort of change up what you're doing depending on the situation. You can try your best to make sure that you deal with all of these possibilities up front by having check-ins and things like that. But on the day, there may just be a bad internet connection, and you're going to have to deal with that. There obviously, if you can't control the environment, there are other possibilities for interruption. You've seen all of the TV, like the news channels and stuff, where the kids come in and they've got their toys and they bring them in and they want to show you stuff, or the animals come in, or there's stuff going on in the background. There might be door-to-door salespeople coming, or if it's political season, there might be folks trying to tell you to vote for their person, and the doorbell goes and stuff like that. It's like, these things will happen, and you become flexible and deal with it as it comes up. So if you move on to the next one, this is like really practical slide, this one. Let's talk about your physical setup. And I want to tell you who this person is. This is Andrew Wood being interviewed as Sister Folsom Delights. Andrew is a member of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, and he did one interview with us where he was Andrew, and we were talking about AIDS activism. And then this interview, he came dressed as Sister Folsom Delights to talk about his work with the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. So this is actually a really good setup that we have here. You can see there are two comfortable chairs facing one another, and there's a small table in between. I would recommend a small table rather than you sitting facing one another at like a kitchen table or a dining room table. And the reason for that is if somebody, especially if they're a little nervous, they might start diddling their leg, and that leg may start hitting the table, the underside of the table. And this has happened before. So this is from experience, I'm telling you. Another thing that people tend to do if they're sitting actually at a table is, if they're getting themselves worked up about something, they start banging the table to sort of emphasize their points. And that comes up you hear that really loudly in the recording, especially if the recorder's sitting on that table. It can be really invasive on the interview itself. So we always try to have people a little further away from the like close enough that you can hear one another, that the audio recorder can pick up the noise, but far enough away from a table where you're not going to be doing all these things that affect the noise with the recorder. If your recorder is one that is like and you can see on this one here, it has the microphones on one end of it. Maybe turn it so that the bulk of the microphone sort of like direction is toward the person being interviewed, because their words are the most important words for that interview. Your words, you know, it's important that you hear what the question is, but it's their voices that are most important. In this interview, we had the camera on a tripod behind the interviewer, so that you don't actually see the interviewer at all. It's kind of right behind their shoulder. And it focuses straight on to the person being interviewed. And basically what you see with here, me upwards, that's kind of what you want in the interview. You don't want somebody just like a sort of necklace head. You want to see like a little part of their body, and you know, make it far enough away so that if they move around, you still get all of them in the frame as well. And yeah, make sure that they're centered in the frame. You don't want me to be sitting like off like this, so you have everything in the background, unless it's something that's really that tells you, adds to the story of what the narrator is speaking to. You know, if there was posters or something or artwork in the background that they're going to be referring to, then that may be some situation where you could have that. You can also see in this picture that we have, I have 2 small bottles of water for the person being interviewed and 1 for the person doing the interview. Always have plenty of water on hand. And you can't really see because Andy's leg's in the way, but there's actually a box of tissues underneath that table, ready for any tears or any snotters that happen along the way. So you want to move forward?
So in the beginning of the interview, you want to make sure you do a proper introduction. And so this needs to include your name, your narrator's name, the date on which the interview is happening, the location, and what project this is for. And I also do a consent on it, that you're consenting to this recording and it's going to be shared on the internet. Do you consent? And they say yes. And so here is an example.
This is Lisa Vallen, archivist for the Southern Labor Archives at Georgia State University, the University Library. Today is May 15th, and I am in Hinsdale, Illinois, with Frank Jervik, Jervik. He was a lifelong member of Local Lodge 126. We are here today to interview for an oral history for the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers Oral History. You are aware that we are sharing this interview, putting it online, and making it available to researchers, students, and other union members across the globe.
Yes.
Welcome.
Awesome.
And I also, a lot of times will spell their last name, just so we're all on the same page on how names are spelled. So talking a little bit about equipment, tools, and apps. There's a lot of things that you can use, some at different prices. And we have a great link here at the bottom that also talks about various recording devices. I always have 2 forms of recording. I have an audio recording and then a video recording. Just in case one of them fails, I have a backup. And I want to make sure they are charged. And if possible, they're plugged in, so that you don't, surprise, run out of power in the middle of it. I also want to make sure they have enough memory to record the interview. And I might, if I, have a video cam that I'm using, I might have an extra SD card just in case. But over on the right-hand side in bold are 2 great recorder apps that you can download on your phone, and that they're high quality. And again, Zoom is also a great way to record an interview if you don't have any other tech that you can use. Okay. So, I think Morna and I are going to play a beginning of the interviews to give you all an idea of kind of what that looks like and feels like. And then if you all want, we're going to put you into breakout rooms in pairs where you can practice recording and doing an interview. And so, Morna, do you want to interview me?
Yeah. So we're going to do this as if we're doing it virtually, because we kind of are. But we would do this very similar like wording of all of this if we were sitting face to face as well. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being willing to be interviewed. I really appreciate it. Before we start, I want to check in. Are you comfortable? Do you need a pillow or anything? You fine?
I'm all good, thank you.
Okay, that's great. Do you need a moment to get something to drink or use the restroom or anything like that?
All
You're
set.
good? That's great. I want to remind you before we start that you're absolutely free to decline to answer any of my questions. I'm going to try really hard not to interject throughout the interview. I want this to be all about you, not about me. Also, you'll see me looking down from time to time. I will be actively listening, just so you know that. I'm just trying to make sure I'm going to keep us on track. And I'll make some notes for follow-up questions. If you need a bio break, just let me know. We can pause the recordings and then just start up again once you're done. And I'm going to start with a grounding statement that provides context for what we're doing. And then I'm going to ask you for permission to record the interview. Are you okay with that?
Sounds
Cool.
good.
All right. So before we start, do you have any concerns or questions about the interview? You good?
No,
Awesome. Well, let's just get started. So my name is Morna Gerrard, and I am interviewing Lisa Vallen for the Activist Women Oral History Project. The date today is March 8th, 2023, and we are recording this interview virtually. Lisa, can you please give me your verbal permission to record the interview?
yeah, that's fine.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's start at the beginning. Can you tell me about your parents, who they were and how they met?
Sure. They are Mark and Mary Vallen. They met in LA because they worked for the same company. And we're kind of set up on a quasi blind date.
Cool. So there was us just getting started. And I would always ask Lisa a bunch of questions about her childhood, about when she was born, about her family. The good reason for doing that is that, first of all, it's important information, but it also helps somebody get relaxed before they start into the meat of the interview. If anyone has never done an interview before, usually, not always, usually talking about your family is a great way to sort of relax you into it. There may be some people who do not want to talk about families if they have trauma or really challenging issues in their past. So just be aware of that. But that's probably something that you will have dealt with as leading up to the actual interview itself, you know, any topics that you don't want to touch on. So it's a straightforward, you know, just saying the words out loud the first time is kind of scary, but once you do it, it's actually, it's fine. So do you want to do some practice?
Yeah. And one other tip, if you're ever not quite sure what to do next, you can always ask them how that made them feel. Or if they're not opening enough or you want to dig in, how did you feel about that?
We use that all the time. How did you feel? We want to know about not just the events that happened, but how they affected people, how things smelled and felt and tasted, and all of this sort of like the stuff that's really human about an event. That's the kind of stuff that you want to bring out.
Yeah. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm also going to stop recording.